The rain was a persistent hum against the window pane of Wei's small apartment, a rhythmic sound that usually brought him peace. He was settling in for the night, the glow of a single lamp casting long, amber shadows across his books, when a frantic knock echoed through the hallway. When he opened the door, the cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and pine. Standing there, drenched and shivering, was Julian. He looked nothing like the composed, sharp-suited man who had walked out of Wei's life 8 months ago. His hair was matted to his forehead, and his eyes, usually so bright with ambition, were clouded with a weary, desperate exhaustion. Before Wei could find his voice, Julian stepped forward. The distance between their past and present vanished in a heartbeat as his ex-boyfriend hugged him. Julian's arms wrapped around Wei's waist with a strength that felt like drowning, his face burying into the crook of Wei's neck. He was trembling, not just from the cold, but from a weight he couldn't carry alone anymore. "I try to handle it," Julian whispered, his voice cracking against Wei's skin. "I thought I could do it all, but everything, the project, the pressure, it's all gone wrong, Wei. I didn't have anywhere else that felt safe." Wei's hands hovered in the air for a second, the memory of their painful goodbye flickering in his mind. But as he felt the damp chill of Julian's coat and the frantic beat of his heart, the resentment melted away. He reached up, resting his hands on Julian's back, pulling him into the warmth of the foyer and kicking the door shut. The night transitioned into a quiet, domestic blur. Wei didn't demand explanations. Instead, he steered Julian toward the bathroom, handing him a thick, charcoal gray sweater and a pair of soft joggers. While the shower hummed in the background, Wei moved to the kitchen. He moved with a practiced grace, whisking cocoa powder and milk in a small pot, adding a pinch of cinnamon, exactly the way Julian used to like it on winter nights. When Julian emerged, the steam from the shower had softened the sharp lines of his face. He sat on the edge of the sofa, wrapped in a fleece blanket that Wei had draped over him. He looked smaller, humbler. Wei set the steaming mug on the coffee table and sat on the rug at Julian's feet, leaning his back against the sofa. For a long time, they just sat in the silence, the only sound being the ticking of the clock and the fading rain. "I miss this," Julian said softly, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "Not just the apartment. I miss the way the world feels quiet when I'm near you. I realized today that I chased everything else, only to find out that none of it mattered if I couldn't come home to this." Wei turned his head slightly, looking up at him. The hurt was still there, a faint scar, but the warmth in the room was healing it. He reached out, resting his hand on Julian's knee. "You're safe here tonight, Julian," Wei murmured. "The trouble out there, it can't get past the door." Julian set the mug down and leaned forward, resting his forehead against Wei's. The tension finally left his shoulders, replaced by a weary peace. They didn't fix the past that night, and they didn't plan the future. They simply stayed in that circle of lamplight, rediscovering the quiet magic of being together, while the storm outside finally ran out of rain. The rain, which had been a frantic drumming against the glass, settled into a low, rhythmic hum. Inside the apartment, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and the faint, grounding smell of Julian's cedarwood cologne, now softened by the steam of the shower. Wei didn't move from his spot on the rug. He could feel the heat radiating from Julian's legs through the thick fleece blanket. For months, this apartment had felt like a museum of a life they once shared, a specific brand of tea in the cupboard Julian liked, a book on the shelf with a receipt as a bookmark from their last trip together. Now the museum had come back to life, breathing and sighing in the dim light. Julian's hand drifted down from a mug, his fingers tentatively brushing the hair at the nape of Wei's neck. It was a hesitant touch, a question asked without words. "I spent so long running," Julian murmured, his voice sounding clearer now, though still heavy with exhaustion. "I thought if I worked harder, climbed higher, I'd finally feel like I'd arrived somewhere. But the higher I got, the colder it felt. And then the merger fell through, the investors pulled out, and suddenly I was standing in a glass office that felt like a cage." He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh that broke in the middle. "I walked out of the building and realized I didn't want to go to my apartment. It's just marble and chrome. It doesn't have your mess. It doesn't have your sketches on the table or the way you always leave the lamp on because you hate walking into a dark room. Wei turned around slowly, shifting so he was sitting cross-legged, facing Julian. The amber light caught the unshed tears in Julian's eyes. The sight of this man, who had always been the pillar of ambition, looking so undone, made a knot of protective warmth tighten in Wei's chest. "You don't have to be the version of you that wins everything here, Julian," Wei said softly. He reached out, taking Julian's cold hands in his own, rubbing his thumbs over the knuckles to bring back the warmth. "You're allowed to just be." Julian leaned down, closing the small gap between them. He rested his forehead against Wei's, closing his eyes. "I don't deserve this. Not after the way I left." "Probably not," Wei whispered with a small, tired smile. "But the cocoa is already made and the rain isn't stopping, so you might as well stay." A small, genuine breath of relief escaped Julian's lips, a sound that was half sob and half laugh. He slid off the sofa and onto the rug, settling beside Wei. They sat there for hours as the night deepened. Julian began to talk in earnest then, not about the business failure, but about the small things he'd missed. The way the light hit the floorboards at noon, the sound of Wei humming while he worked, the quiet safety of being known. As the clock ticked toward 3 in the morning, the heavy weight of the day finally took its toll. Wei stood up, his joints a bit stiff, and extended a hand. Julian took it, his grip firm and grounding. Wei led him to the bedroom, where the sheets were crisp and smelled of lavender. He pulled back the duvet, and Julian climbed in, looking exhausted to his very marrow. Wei started to turn toward the door, intending to sleep on the sofa, but a hand caught his wrist. "Please," Julian whispered into the darkness. "Just stay, until I fall asleep. I'm afraid if I close my eyes, I'll wake up back in that glass office." Wei hesitated for only a second before sliding into the bed beside him. The space between them felt like a canyon for a moment, charged with the history of their breakup, but then Julian moved. He reached out, pulling Wei back against his chest, tucking his chin over Wei's shoulder. It wasn't a sexual gesture. It was the embrace of someone who had been lost at sea and had finally found a piece of driftwood to cling to. His breath slowed, evening out into the deep rhythm of sleep. Wei lay there, watching the shadows of the rain dance on the ceiling, feeling the steady, warm heartbeat against his back. The trouble outside hadn't disappeared. The morning would bring phone calls, lawyers, and the mess of a collapsed career. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of the room, there was only the sound of two people breathing in unison. The coldness that had settled in Wei's bones 8 months ago was finally beginning to thaw. He closed his eyes, letting the familiar warmth pull him under. For the first time in a long time, the apartment didn't feel like a museum. It felt like a home. The pale, golden light of morning filtered through the sheer curtains, dancing across the tangled sheets. Wei woke slowly, the usual silence of his bedroom replaced by the steady, deep rhythm of someone else's breathing. For a moment, he remained still, afraid that moving would shatter the fragile peace of the room. He could feel the weight of Julian's arm draped over his waist, a heavy, warm anchor that had stayed there all through the night. Julian stirred, his grip tightening instinctively before his eyes even opened. When they did, they were clear of the frantic desperation from the night before, replaced by a soft, vulnerable realization. He didn't pull away. Instead, he tucked his face into the back of Wei's neck, breathing in the scent of home. "I'm still here," Julian whispered, his voice raspy with sleep. "I thought I dreamed it." Wei turned in the circle of Julian's arms, facing him. The morning light was unforgiving, showing the dark circles under Julian's eyes and the faint lines of stress, but also caught the genuine softness in his expression. "It wasn't a dream, but the world is awake now, Julian. You have phone calls to make. You have to face the trouble." Julian sighed, a long, weary sound, but he nodded. The sharp, untouchable CEO was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had finally found his footing on solid ground. "I know. The office, the investors, the mess. It's all waiting. But for the first time in months, I don't feel like I'm suffocating when I think about it. He sat up, the duvet falling to his waist, and looked around the room. It was messy, stacks of Way's sketches on the dresser, a stray sock near the closet, and it was perfect. He reached out, taking Way's hand and interlacing their fingers. I have to go back and fix what I can. It's going to be a long day, probably a long month. Way squeezed his hand, his thumb tracing the back of Julian's knuckles. I know. Julian looked at him intensely, his thumb hovering near Way's cheek. Can I come back? Not because I'm in trouble, just because I don't want to be anywhere else. Way felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the sunlight. He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, acknowledging the hurt they had moved past and the bridge they were starting to rebuild. Finally, he gave a small, encouraging nod. The spare key is still in the ceramic pot by the door, Way said softly. I never had the heart to move it. A bright, genuine smile broke across Julian's face, the first real smile Way had seen in nearly a year. It transformed him, chasing away the shadows of the corporate world. Julian leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to Way's forehead, a silent promise of effort and presence. As Julian dressed in the borrowed, slightly too small clothes, there was a new kind of energy in the room. It wasn't the frantic energy of a crisis, but the quiet strength of a fresh start. When Julian reached the door, he paused, looking back one last time. See you tonight? Way leaned against the kitchen counter, a mug of coffee in his hands, the steam rising in the morning light. See you tonight, Julian. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in 8 months, the echo it left behind wasn't one of loneliness. It was the sound of a door that was finally, truly open. 3 weeks later, the rain had been replaced by the soft, persistent heat of late spring. The glass office was a memory now. The company had been restructured, and Julian had stepped down from the frantic heights of his old position. He was working for a smaller firm, one that didn't demand his soul in exchange for a paycheck. Way returned home that evening to find the apartment smelling of garlic and herbs. The windows were cracked open, letting in the golden hour light and the distant sounds of the city. Julian was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, looking intensely focused on a recipe he had pulled from one of Way's old cookbooks. He didn't look like the man who had collapsed on the doorstep weeks ago. There was a healthy color in his cheeks, and the tension that used to permanently hitch his shoulders had finally smoothed out. When he heard the door click, he didn't jump. He simply looked over his shoulder and smiled. You're home, Julian said, and the word home sounded natural in his mouth again. Way dropped his bag and walked over, watching as Julian plated 2 servings of pasta. There was a comfortable rhythm to their movements now, a domestic choreography they had spent the last 21 days relearning. They didn't talk about the trouble anymore. They talked about the books they were reading, the sketches Way was finishing, and the quiet plans they were making for the weekend. As they sat down at the small wooden table, the light hitting the surface in warm, honeyed streaks, Julian reached across and took Way's hand. I used to think that success meant never having to look back, Julian said quietly, his eyes fixed on Way's. But I realized that looking back was the only thing that saved me. Thank you for letting me back in. Way squeezed his hand, a soft smile tugging at his lips. I think we both needed to look back to see where we were actually going. They ate in a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with apologies or explanations. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights began to twinkle like fallen stars, they stood together on the small balcony. Julian pulled Way close, wrapping his arms around him from behind, not out of desperation this time, but out of a deep, settled peace. The world outside was still loud and complicated, but inside the circle of that embrace, everything was exactly where it was meant to be. The story that had started with a frantic knock in the rain had turned into a quiet conversation in the sun, proving that sometimes the best way to move forward is to return to the heart that never truly let you go.